The afternoon sun hung low over the tarmac as passengers shuffled toward the gate, dragging suitcases and scrolling through phones, lost in their own worlds. Among them was a man in a navy blazer and dark slacks, his expression calm but his shoulders carrying the quiet weight of exhaustion. He'd just wrapped up a 3-day medical conference in Chicago. Lectures, panels, late-night strategy sessions with colleagues about staffing shortages and burnout in emergency departments. Now, all he wanted was to get home, shower, and sleep in his own bed for the first time in days. He carried a black medical bag, well used but meticulously maintained. The leather was scuffed at the corners, the silver clasp slightly tarnished, but everything inside was organized with precision. A stethoscope coiled neatly beside a compact otoscope, trauma shears, vials of emergency meds, a portable pulse oximeter. It wasn't just luggage. It was an extension of his profession. As an emergency room physician, he never traveled without it. You never knew when someone might collapse in an airport, choke on a snack mid-flight, or go into anaphylaxis from a peanut. He'd used that bag more times than he could count. Not for show, but because duty didn't clock out when he left the hospital. Boarding began. He waited patiently in line, ID and boarding pass ready. The gate agent barely glanced at them before waving him through. Inside the plane, the cabin was warm, the air thick with the scent of coffee and recycled air. He moved down the aisle, scanning for his window seat in row 14. That's when the first tension surfaced. A flight attendant stood near the galley, arms crossed, eyes sharp with the kind of stress that comes from a delayed inbound flight and a tight turnaround. She watched him approach, her gaze locking onto the black bag in his hand. Most passengers carried backpacks or roller bags. This stood out. "Sir," she said, voice clipped. "That bag needs to go in the overhead." He stopped, surprised but polite. "It's a medical bag," he said gently. "I'm a doctor. I keep it with me in case of emergencies." She didn't smile, didn't soften. "All bags over 10 pounds go overhead, policy." "It's under 10, he replied, holding it out slightly. "And even if it weren't, FAA guidelines allow medical professionals to carry essential equipment in the cabin." She narrowed her eyes. "I don't care what the FAA says. If it's not a purse or a laptop bag, it goes up top." A few nearby passengers turned to watch. He felt the shift, the sudden spotlight, the unspoken assumption that he was being difficult rather than reasonable. He took a breath. "Look," he said, keeping his tone even. "I'm not trying to cause trouble. This bag has fragile instruments. If it's tossed around, things could break. I've flown with it dozens of times. No one's ever had an issue." That's when another crew member joined, a taller man with a stiff posture and a name tag that read, "Lead Attendant." He sized up the situation in seconds. "Is there a problem here?" "She's insisting I stow my medical bag," the doctor explained. "I'm happy to show my license or credentials if that helps." The lead attendant didn't ask for credentials, didn't ask questions. He simply reached out, grabbed the bag by the handle and yanked it from the doctor's grip. Before anyone could react, he shoved it hard into the overhead bin above an empty seat, so hard the bin rattled. The doctor flinched, not from fear but from the sheer disrespect of it. That bag held tools he'd used to save lives. It wasn't just property. It was trust made tangible. "Problem solved," the lead attendant said flatly, already turning away. The doctor stood there for a moment, heart pounding, not with anger, but with disbelief. He'd been profiled before, followed in stores, questioned about his ID at conferences. But this felt different. This was in uniform, in plain sight, with no ambiguity about who he was or why he carried what he carried. And yet his professionalism had been treated like a threat. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He knew how that would be interpreted. Instead, he walked to his seat, sat down, and stared out the window as the plane taxied. Around him, people chatted, adjusted headphones, flipped through magazines, life moving on as if nothing had happened. But inside, something had shifted. This wasn't just about a bag. It was about whose expertise gets respected, whose presence is presumed legitimate, and whose is treated as suspicious by default. About 20 minutes into the flight, a woman 2 rows ahead began gasping. Her face went pale, her hands clawing at her throat. "I can't breathe," she wheezed. Panic rippled through the cabin. A flight attendant rushed over, fumbling with the intercom. "Is there a doctor on board?" The doctor unbuckled his seatbelt instantly. "I'm right here." He stood, but the lead attendant, the same one who'd thrown his bag, blocked his path. "Wait," he said, suspicious. "You said you were a doctor earlier. How do I know you're not just saying that now?" The woman was turning blue. "I have my license in my wallet," the doctor said, voice steady despite the urgency. "But right now she needs oxygen or an epinephrine shot. Where's your medical kit?" The attendant hesitated. Just a second, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, he stepped aside. The doctor reached into the overhead bin, retrieved his bag and snapped it open. Inside, everything was exactly where it should be, thankfully undamaged. He pulled out an epinephrine auto-injector, checked the woman's symptoms, and administered the dose. Within minutes, her breathing eased. Color returned to her face. Passengers exhaled in collective relief. Later, as the plane descended, the woman tearfully thanked him. "You saved my life," she whispered. He nodded. "Just glad I had what I needed." But the irony wasn't lost on him. The very bag they'd treated like contraband had just prevented a tragedy. No one apologized. No one acknowledged the earlier confrontation. The crew moved on as if the incident had never happened. When the plane touched down, he was one of the last to deplane. He walked slowly through the terminal, the weight of the day pressing down. At the customer service desk near baggage claim, he paused. He pulled out his phone, opened the airline's app, and filed a formal complaint. Not angry, not dramatic, just factual. "On Flight 482, my medical bag was forcibly taken and mishandled by crew despite identifying myself as a physician. Later, that same bag was used to treat a passenger in distress. Request review of crew training protocols regarding medical professionals and racial bias." He didn't expect much. Airlines get hundreds of complaints a day. Most vanish into digital voids. But something about this felt different. As he stepped outside into the cool evening air, a stranger approached, a man in his 60s holding a phone. "Hey," the man said quietly. "I was on your flight. Saw what happened. I recorded part of it." He showed a short clip. The moment the bag was snatched and shoved into the bin, the doctor's stunned silence, the dismissive turn of the attendant's back. "I didn't know if I should send it to you or the news. Figured you should decide." The doctor looked at the screen. There it was. Proof not of violence, but of something quieter, more insidious. The erasure of competence, the assumption of threat where there was none. He thanked the man, exchanged contact info, and walked to his car. That night, he didn't sleep much. He replayed the scene in his head. The tone of the attendant's voice, the way his credentials were dismissed without a glance, the hesitation before they let him help. He thought about his colleagues, especially the women and people of color who'd shared similar stories, being mistaken for orderlies, questioned about their degrees, followed in hospital hallways by security. By morning, he knew he couldn't let it go, not for himself, but for everyone who'd been made to feel like an imposter in their own profession. He called a civil rights legal aid group he'd worked with during med school. They listened. They asked for the video. They said they'd look into it. He didn't want a lawsuit. He didn't want headlines. He just wanted the next doctor, black, brown, female immigrant who boarded a plane with their medical bag, to be met with respect, not suspicion. To be seen not as a problem to be managed, but as a resource to be valued. What he didn't know yet was that this small act of accountability would ripple far beyond a customer service complaint. It would reach boardrooms, insurance underwriters, federal regulators. It would cost the airline more than they ever imagined, not in fines, but in trust and credibility, in the very foundation of their operational safety net. But all of that was still ahead. For now, he made coffee, checked his hospital email, and prepared for another shift in the ER. Because whether the world acknowledged it or not, he was still a doctor. And doctors show up, even when they've been told in 100 quiet ways that they don't belong. A week passed. Life moved on, or tried to. The doctor returned to his usual rhythm. 12-hour shifts in the ER, charting between patient visits, grabbing coffee that had long gone cold. But something lingered beneath the surface, like a bruise you keep pressing without meaning to. Every time he zipped open his medical bag, he remembered the way it had been yanked from his hand. Not roughly, not violently, but with a casual disregard that somehow cut deeper. He'd heard nothing from the airline. No follow-up, no acknowledgement of his complaint. Just silence. That in itself told a story. Then on a Tuesday morning, his phone buzzed with a message from the passenger who'd recorded the video. Someone posted a clip online, it read. It's getting shared. He clicked the link. It was a trimmed version of the footage, just 20 seconds, but it was enough. The camera caught the moment the lead attendant grabbed the bag, the doctor's stunned pause, the dismissive turn away. The caption read, "Flight crew throws black doctor's medical bag like trash. Later begs him to save a passenger." Within hours, the post had thousands of shares. Comments poured in, some angry, some supportive, some skeptical. "Are you sure he's a doctor?" one asked. Another replied, "Why does it matter? Even if he wasn't, that's no way to treat anyone." But the thread that kept resurfacing was this. Why was his word not enough? Why did he have to prove himself twice, once to be believed and again to be useful? Local news picked it up. A reporter reached out, polite but persistent. The doctor hesitated. He wasn't looking for fame, but he also knew silence protected the wrong people, so he agreed to a brief interview, on one condition. No dramatic music, no reenactments, just the facts. The segment aired that evening. Calm voice, steady gaze. He described what happened without exaggeration. "I wasn't angry in the moment," he said. "I was confused. Because I've worn this blazer, carried this bag, through airports all over the country. Never once has someone treated me like I was hiding something dangerous inside it." The airline responded the next day. Not to him, but to the press. A short statement. "Our crew followed standard safety protocols. We take all passenger concerns seriously and are reviewing the matter." It was the kind of language designed to sound responsible while saying nothing at all. Reviewing the matter could mean anything or nothing. But what the statement didn't mention was that this wasn't the first time. Behind the scenes, a quiet pattern was emerging. Journalists started digging. They filed public records requests. They spoke to former employees. And what they found painted a troubling picture. Over the past 18 months, at least 4 other complaints had been filed against the same airline involving black professionals, teachers, engineers, nurses being questioned, searched, or removed from flights after being misidentified as suspicious. In 2 cases, passengers were asked to leave the plane entirely. All had documentation, badges, IDs, work emails, but none were given the benefit of the doubt. One former flight attendant, speaking on condition of anonymity, told a reporter, "There's this unspoken thing. If someone doesn't look like they belong in business class or carrying something unusual, some crew members default to suspicion. And management never really corrects it unless there's a media storm." The doctor read these reports with a mix of sadness and grim recognition. It wasn't about one bad apple. It was about a system that allowed assumptions to override training. Meanwhile, the airline's social media team scrambled. They posted generic messages about valuing diversity and committing to inclusion. They even announced a new cultural sensitivity workshop for staff. But the timing was too convenient, the language too corporate. People noticed. Memes mocked the sudden pivot. "Oh no, our racism cost us PR points. Quick, schedule a Zoom training." Then came the legal letter. The doctor hadn't sued, but his legal advisor, connected through the civil rights group, sent a formal inquiry to the airline's corporate office. Not a threat, but a request. Release the internal investigation report on the incident, disclose crew training materials on handling medical professionals, and confirm whether bias assessments were part of employee evaluations. The airline's legal team replied within 48 hours. "We cannot comply due to ongoing internal review and privacy considerations." But buried in the footnotes was a detail that raised eyebrows. The internal review wasn't just about this one flight. It referenced multiple service-related escalations involving the same crew members over the past year. That meant someone upstairs already knew. Around the same time, a flight attendant from another route reached out privately. She'd seen the video and recognized the lead attendant. "He's been written up before," she wrote in a direct message. Once for refusing to believe a black pilot was actually the captain. Another time for accusing a woman with a prosthetic leg of hiding something in it. Nothing ever stuck. "He's got friends in operations." The doctor didn't respond immediately. He sat with that message for a long time. It wasn't just about him. It never had been. He decided to go further. Not with anger, but with strategy. He contacted a national physicians advocacy network. They dealt with similar cases. Doctors denied access to medical conferences, mistaken for criminals during house calls. even arrested while trying to help at accident scenes. They agreed to amplify his story, not as an isolated incident, but as part of a broader pattern of professional erasure. A panel discussion was organized, virtual, free to the public. Doctors, nurses, EMTs shared their experiences, being ignored when they identified themselves during emergencies, having their credentials questioned while white colleagues in the same scrubs were instantly believed, being followed in hospital parking lots after night shifts. The doctor spoke last. "I don't carry this bag to impress anyone," he said, holding it up to the camera. "I carry it because my job doesn't end when I walk out the hospital door. And when that commitment is met with suspicion instead of support, it doesn't just hurt me, it puts passengers at risk. Because next time the person who could help might think twice before stepping forward." The video of that panel went viral, not in a flashy way, but steadily, deeply, shared by medical schools, nursing associations, even airline employee unions. One union rep commented, "We've been asking for better bias training for years. Maybe now they'll listen." Back at the airline, pressure mounted. Employees started speaking up internally. An anonymous letter circulated among crew members. "We're trained to handle turbulence, medical emergencies, unruly passengers, but not our own biases. And that's the real safety risk." Still, the airline held its ground publicly. But behind closed doors, executives were nervous, not just because of public opinion, but because something far more concrete was looming on the horizon. Their $520 million liability insurance policy, the one that covered everything from crash lawsuits to discrimination claims, was up for renewal in less than 2 months, and their insurer, a major global firm known for strict ethical underwriting, had already flagged them. Unbeknownst to the public, the insurer had sent a quiet inquiry the week before. "Please provide documentation of your anti-bias training protocols, incident response procedures, and any recent complaints involving discriminatory conduct by crew." The airline's compliance team panicked. Their training materials were outdated. Their complaint logs showed a clear pattern. And now, with this story trending nationally, they couldn't spin their way out. But none of that was visible yet. To the outside world, it still looked like a single complaint. A viral video, a company issuing hollow statements. The doctor knew better. He could feel the shift, the way emails from the airline's legal team grew terser, the way reporters started asking sharper questions. One evening, as he walked out of the hospital after a double shift, his phone rang. It was the journalist who'd first interviewed him. "I found something," she said, voice low. "Internal emails from the airline's customer relations head to their legal department, dated 2 days after your flight. Subject line, high-risk passenger incident, potential media exposure. They called you a reputational vulnerability." He didn't react at first. Then he laughed, a short, dry sound. Of course they did, but the laugh faded fast. Because the real story wasn't about being called a vulnerability. It was about what happened when a company treated human dignity as a PR problem instead of a core value. He thanked the reporter, hung up, looked up at the night sky, clear and full of stars. He thought about the woman on the plane, gasping for air. He thought about the next doctor who might hesitate before raising their hand on a flight. He thought about the crew members who knew better but stayed silent. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And for the first time, he allowed himself to hope. Not for revenge, but for change. Real structural inconvenient change. The kind that doesn't come from a single apology, but from systems forced to reckon with their own blind spots. He got in his car, started the engine, and drove home. Tomorrow there would be more patients, more lives to tend to. But tonight he let himself rest, knowing that sometimes just telling the truth clearly and calmly is the first step toward making the world a little less broken. The story should have faded by now. Most viral moments do, flaring bright for a few days, then dissolving into the endless scroll of online noise. But this one didn't. Instead, it kept growing, not louder, but deeper. People weren't just sharing the video anymore. They were asking questions, real ones, the kind that don't have easy answers. Reporters started calling not just the doctor, but aviation experts, insurance analysts, even former FAA officials. At first, it seemed like overkill. A bag thrown in a plane cabin, a complaint filed, a company issuing vague statements. But then someone connected the dots to something much bigger. Money. Not just any money, $520 million worth of it. It started with a quiet rumor in financial circles. The airline's primary insurer, one of the largest in the world, was reevaluating its coverage, not raising rates, not adding clauses, considering walking away entirely. That kind of move was almost unheard of for a major carrier. Airlines live and die by their insurance. It's not optional. Without it, they can't legally operate scheduled flights. No insurer, no planes in the sky. Why would an insurer take such a drastic step over a single incident? Because it wasn't just one incident. And insurers don't care about headlines, they care about patterns, risk, and long-term liability. Behind closed doors, the insurer had been watching for a while. Over the past 2 years, they'd received 3 formal notices from advocacy groups about discriminatory treatment on this airline. 2 involved medical professionals. 1 involved a black engineer removed from a flight after his laptop toolkit raised suspicion. Each time, the airline had downplayed it. Each time, the insurer filed the report under low severity. But this latest case was different. The video was clear. The doctor's credentials were verified. The crew's actions were captured on camera. And worst of all, internal airline emails, leaked to a watchdog group, showed supervisors had been warned about the lead attendant's behavior months earlier. They'd even discussed reassigning him but decided against it to avoid morale issues. That changed everything. To the insurer, this wasn't just poor customer service. It was evidence of a systemic failure in risk management. And in their world, risk didn't just mean crashes or mechanical failures. It meant lawsuits, reputational damage, regulatory fines, loss of public trust, all of which cost money, real, staggering amounts of it. The insurer's underwriting team pulled the airline's full file. They cross-referenced it with data from the Department of Transportation, which tracks discrimination complaints. They found 8 unresolved complaints in the last 18 months, all involving race, all involving crew judgment calls that overrode passenger credentials. None had resulted in disciplinary action. Then they looked at their own contract. Buried in Section 14, Clause B, the insured must maintain operational practices that uphold passenger dignity, safety, and non-discriminatory conduct as defined by federal and international standards. It was a standard clause, rarely enforced. But now it had teeth. The insurer didn't announce anything publicly. No press release, no statement. Instead, they sent a private letter to the airline's CEO, not a threat, a notice. Based on recent events and historical data, we are initiating a full risk reassessment of your liability coverage. Please provide updated training protocols, incident response logs, and executive accountability measures within 14 days. 14 days. That's all the airline had to prove they weren't a liability. Not just to passengers, but to the very companies that kept them flying. Inside the airline's headquarters, panic set in. Executives who dismissed the doctor's complaint as PR noise now saw it for what it really was, a crack in the foundation. And cracks, if ignored, can bring down entire structures. They scrambled. HR pulled together a bias mitigation presentation overnight. Legal drafted a new passenger interaction policy that sounded good on paper but lacked enforcement. Marketing proposed a campaign, "We see you. We respect you." But none of it addressed the core issue, a culture where certain passengers were presumed guilty until proven useful. Meanwhile, the doctor went about his life. He didn't know about the insurer's letter. He didn't know his complaint had triggered a financial earthquake. He only knew that more people were reaching out. Other doctors, flight attendants, even a retired pilot who'd faced similar treatment decades ago. They weren't asking for advice. They were saying thank you. Thank you for speaking up. Thank you for not letting it go. One afternoon, he received an unexpected call from a woman who identified herself as a compliance officer at a major insurance firm. She didn't name her company, but her questions were specific. "Can you describe exactly what the crew said? Did they ask for identification? Was there any discussion of your medical credentials before they took the bag?" He answered honestly, calmly. He didn't embellish. He didn't downplay. And when she thanked him and hung up, he had a feeling something bigger was unfolding. A few days later, a financial news outlet published a short piece. Major carrier faces insurance reassessment amid discrimination allegations. It didn't name the airline outright, but industry insiders knew. Stock prices dipped. Analysts issued cautious notes. Competitors quietly began poaching corporate clients with promises of more inclusive travel experiences. The airline tried to contain it. They held an emergency press briefing. The CEO stood at a podium, flanked by diversity consultants and a newly appointed chief inclusion officer. He apologized for any passenger who felt disrespected, announced mandatory bias training for all 12,000 crew members, and pledged to review every complaint with fresh eyes. But the words rang hollow. Because just hours before the press conference, internal memos revealed the airline had quietly settled 2 other discrimination cases out of court, with strict non-disclosure agreements. They were fixing the symptoms, not the disease. Back in the ER, the doctor treated a young man who'd been assaulted outside a bus station. As he stitched the gash above the man's eye, they talked. The man mentioned he worked as a baggage handler at the airport. "I saw that video," he said softly. "Happens more than people think. Some crew act like they're guarding a fortress, not serving passengers." The doctor nodded. "It shouldn't be that way." "No," the man said. "But it is, until someone makes it cost them." That phrase stuck with him. Until someone makes it cost them. He hadn't set out to hurt the airline. He'd only wanted to be treated like a human being with a job to do. But maybe, just maybe, the real path to change wasn't through apologies or training modules. It was through consequences that couldn't be ignored. A week later, the insurer's deadline passed. The airline submitted their documents, polished, rehearsed, full of buzzwords like equity and belonging. But the insurer wasn't impressed. Their analysts compared the new materials to past incidents. The gaps were glaring. No clear escalation path for bias complaints. No independent oversight. No consequences for repeat offenders. Then came the final blow. A whistleblower inside the insurer's own risk department leaked a summary of their internal assessment to a trusted journalist. It read, "The carrier demonstrates a pattern of reactive, not proactive conduct regarding discriminatory incidents. Leadership prioritizes optics over structural reform. Renewal of 520 mailer policy cannot be justified under current risk profile." The story exploded, not on social media, but in boardrooms, investor calls, and government offices. This wasn't about feelings anymore. It was about solvency. The airline's stock dropped 18% in one day. Major corporate clients paused travel contracts. Pilots' unions demanded emergency meetings. Even the Department of Transportation issued a rare public statement. "We are monitoring the situation closely and will investigate compliance with civil rights regulations." Through it all, the doctor stayed quiet. He didn't gloat, didn't post "I told you so" messages. He simply kept showing up. Stethoscope around his neck, medical bag at his side, ready to help whoever walked through the ER doors next. But people noticed his silence. And in that silence, they heard something powerful. This wasn't personal. It was professional. It was principled. One evening, as he sat in his car after a long shift, his phone buzzed. It was the journalist again. "They're not renewing the policy," she said. "Official word comes tomorrow." "But it's done." He exhaled slowly. "What happens now?" "Now," she said. "They either find a new insurer, which no one will touch without major changes, or they ground their fleet." He looked out at the hospital parking lot, empty except for a few night shift workers heading home. He thought about the woman on the plane, gasping for air. He thought about the crew who dismissed him, then needed him. He thought about all the people who'd been made to feel like outsiders in spaces they belonged in. This wasn't justice, but it was accountability, and sometimes accountability is the first real step toward respect. He started the car, turned on the radio, and drove home. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, but tonight, for the first time in weeks, he felt something close to peace, not because he'd won, but because the system, just for a moment, had blinked. The news hit like a delayed thunderclap, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. Early one Thursday morning, before most commuters had finished their coffee, a short statement appeared on the insurer's website. "After careful review, we will not renew our primary liability coverage for airline name effective next month. No fanfare. No explanation beyond risk reassessment." But in the aviation world, those words might as well have been a death sentence. Within hours, the dominoes began to fall. The airline couldn't operate without that $520 million policy. It wasn't just about lawsuits. Federal regulations required minimum liability coverage for scheduled commercial flights. No insurance, no takeoff. Simple as that. By noon, the airline grounded 40% of its domestic fleet. Cancellations poured in. Passengers scrambled for refunds or rebookings on rival carriers. Employees showed up to work only to be sent home. At the airline's headquarters, executives held emergency meetings behind closed doors. Voices rising, tempers fraying. For years, they'd treated discrimination complaints as minor PR hiccups, nuisances to be smoothed over with apologies and training slides. Now those same nuisances had cost them the financial bedrock of their entire operation. The CEO, who just weeks earlier had stood at a podium talking about inclusion, was now testifying before a congressional subcommittee on transportation equity. Cameras flashed as he sat stiffly at the witness table, sweating under the lights. Lawmakers weren't asking about customer service anymore. They wanted to know why internal warnings about biased crew behavior had been ignored, why settlements were buried under NDAs, why a doctor with verified credentials had been treated like a threat. He stumbled through answers citing isolated incidents and human error, but the committee had the emails, the complaint logs, the whistleblower testimonies. One representative, a former flight attendant herself, leaned forward and asked quietly, "When did passenger dignity become optional?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Meanwhile, the doctor watched it all unfold from his hospital break room, sipping lukewarm tea between shifts. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't dreamed of seeing airline executives grilled on national TV, but he also knew this moment wasn't really about him. It was about every person who'd been told, in 1,000 small ways, that their presence was suspicious simply because of how they looked. What surprised him most wasn't the fallout, it was the silence from the airline's own employees. For days, nothing. Then slowly voices began to emerge. Not from management, but from the tarmac, the cabins, the maintenance hangars. A group of flight attendants, many of them women of color, published an open letter. Not an attack, but a plea. "We love our jobs," as they wrote, "but we've been trained to follow orders, not question them. When we've raised concerns about how certain passengers are treated, we're told to stay in our lane. Now our entire airline is grounded, and we're scared not just for our paychecks, but for our integrity." Another letter came from a veteran pilot with 25 years at the company. "I've flown this airline through storms, mechanical failures, even a bird strike. But I've never felt this kind of turbulence, moral turbulence. We lost our way when we started seeing passengers as problems instead of people." These weren't radicals. They were professionals who'd stayed loyal through pay cuts, furloughs, and pandemic chaos. And now they were saying out loud what many had whispered for years: the culture was broken. The Department of Transportation launched a formal civil rights investigation. The FAA announced new guidelines requiring all U.S. carriers to document how they verify and accommodate medical professionals on board. Even the insurance industry took notice. 2 other major insurers quietly updated their underwriting policies to include demonstrated anti-bias protocols as a condition for coverage. But the most unexpected turn came from within. The airline itself, faced with total operational collapse, the board forced out the CEO and 2 senior vice presidents. In their place, they appointed an interim leadership team, one that included an outside ethics advisor and, for the first time in the company's history, a passenger advocacy director with real authority, not just a title. Their first act, reaching out to the doctor, not with a legal team, not with a PR consultant, just a phone call, a simple request: "We'd like to meet." Not to defend, to listen. He almost said no. Too much damage had been done. Too many empty promises made. But then he thought about the next flight attendant who might hesitate before calling for a doctor. The next passenger who might suffer because someone's expertise was doubted. So he agreed. The meeting took place in a small conference room at the airline's regional office. No cameras, no press, just 3 people. The doctor, the new head of customer experience, and the newly appointed inclusion officer. They didn't offer excuses. They brought data. Every complaint filed in the last 2 years, every internal memo, every training module. They admitted they'd failed. Not just him, but their own staff and passengers. "We don't expect forgiveness," the inclusion officer said, "but we want to fix this, and we need your help." He didn't commit on the spot, But he asked one question. Will you let me speak directly to your crew trainers? Not as a victim, but as a partner? They said yes. A week later, he stood in front of a room of 30 flight instructors, the people who shaped how new attendants handled everything from turbulence to medical emergencies. He didn't lecture. He told stories about the time he helped deliver a baby in an airport bathroom, about the elderly man he revived after a heart attack on a red-eye flight, about how his bag wasn't just leather and metal. It was trust, preparedness, a promise to help when called. Then he showed them the video, the moment his bag was thrown. This, he said, is what happens when you assume instead of ask. When you see a black man with a bag and think threat instead of doctor. And the scary part, you might not even realize you're doing it. Afterward, one instructor raised her hand. What should we do differently? Start by believing people when they tell you who they are, he said. Ask for ID if you need to, but do it with respect. And remember, the person you dismissed today might be the one saving a life tomorrow. Back at the hospital, life continued. But something had shifted, not just in the airline, but in the air itself. Passengers reported crew members double-checking credentials with courtesy. Medical professionals said they felt less anxious boarding planes. Even the tone of customer service calls changed, less robotic, more human. The doctor didn't become a celebrity. He didn't write a book or launch a speaking tour. He just kept doing his job. But now, when he zipped open his medical bag on a flight, he noticed the way attendants paused, nodded, sometimes even said, "Thank you for carrying that." One evening, as he walked through the airport after a conference, a young woman in a flight attendant uniform stopped him. "I saw your testimony," she said. "I'm in the new training program. We use your case study now, not as a warning, but as a lesson in dignity." He smiled. "Good," she hesitated. "Do you think we can really change?" He looked around. At the bustling terminal, the mix of faces, the constant flow of people trusting strangers to carry them safely through the sky. "Change isn't fast," he said. "But it starts when people stop accepting that's just how it is. You're already part of it." She thanked him and walked away, shoulders a little straighter. He kept walking, his medical bag in hand. Not as a symbol, not as a weapon, just as what it had always been, a tool ready for the next call. And for the first time in a long time, he felt sure that when he answered he'd be seen, not as a problem but as a person. Months had passed since the flight that changed everything. The headlines had faded, the congressional hearings wrapped up, and the airline, though still limping, was flying again, thanks to a last-minute emergency insurance deal with a smaller firm that came with strict conditions, independent oversight, quarterly bias audits, and a passenger dignity charter co-signed by civil rights groups. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in a world that often settles for performative change, real was rare. The doctor hadn't sought the spotlight, and now that it had dimmed, he was glad. He preferred the quiet rhythm of the ER, the beeping monitors, the hushed voices at the nurse's station, the steady work of healing. But he hadn't disappeared either. He'd said yes to a role he never imagined, helping redesign how flight crews interact with medical professionals. Not as a consultant with a fancy title, but as someone in the room when training scripts were written, when scenarios were rehearsed, when new policies took shape. He didn't lecture. He listened. He asked questions like, "What would make you feel safe calling for help? And how can we make it easier for you to believe someone's credentials without making them feel like a suspect?" The flight attendants, many of them exhausted, underpaid, and overworked, opened up in ways they hadn't before. They admitted they'd been trained to prioritize control over curiosity, to assume noncompliance before cooperation. "We're told to trust our gut," one said. But no one ever asked whose gut gets trusted, and whose doesn't. That conversation became the seed of a new module in crew training. Beyond assumptions. It didn't just teach what to do, it asked why they'd been doing it differently all along. Role plays included scenarios with doctors, nurses, paramedics of all genders and skin tones. Trainees practiced verifying credentials with respect, not suspicion. They learned that a medical bag wasn't contraband, it was a lifeline. The real test came on a routine Tuesday morning. A regional flight from Denver to Minneapolis was halfway through its journey when a passenger in seat 12B began clutching his chest. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His breathing turned shallow. A flight attendant rushed over, heart pounding, not just from the emergency but from the memory of past mistakes. She picked up the intercom. "Is there a medical professional on board?" Two hands went up. One belonged to a nurse in scrubs returning from a conference. The other to an older man in a polo shirt who said quietly, "I'm an ER physician." The lead attendant, newly trained, nerves tight, nodded. "Thank you both. May I see your credentials, please?" The nurse handed over her hospital ID. The doctor pulled out his license from his wallet. No hesitation. No challenge. "Just a calm exchange, thank you," the attendant said. "We have a basic medical kit, but if you need anything else..." The doctor opened his black bag, still scuffed, still reliable. "I've got what we need." He checked the passenger's vitals, administered aspirin and nitroglycerin from his own supply, and stayed with him until the plane made an emergency landing in Sioux Falls. The passenger recovered fully. Later, he wrote a letter to the airline not to complain, but to praise the crew's professionalism and the doctor's calm presence. What made the letter stand out wasn't the gratitude, it was the detail. No one questioned whether the doctor was really a doctor. They just let him help. That small sentence carried more weight than any press release ever could. Back at the airline's training center, the letter was read aloud in the next instructor meeting. Not as a victory lap, but as proof that change was possible, not through grand gestures, but through daily choices. A tone of voice, a pause before judgment, a willingness to believe. The doctor didn't hear about the letter until weeks later. By then, he was back in the ER, stitching up a teenager who'd fallen off his bike. As he worked, the boy's mother watched quietly. When he finished, she said, "You're the doctor from that airline story, aren't you?" He paused. "I guess I am." "My sister's a flight attendant," she said. "She told me they're doing things differently now. She said your name comes up in training, not as a victim but as a reason to do better." He didn't know what to say. So he just nodded. "I hope it sticks." "It already has," she said. That was the thing about real change. It didn't announce itself with fireworks. It showed up in the quiet moments. A nurse allowed to keep her trauma kit in the cabin. A pilot's ID accepted without a second glance. A black engineer boarding first class without being asked to double-check his ticket. The airline still had a long way to go. Trust wasn't rebuilt in a quarter, but something fundamental had shifted. Employees no longer feared speaking up about bias. Passengers filed fewer complaints, not because they stopped experiencing issues, but because issues were addressed before they escalated. And the insurer? They hadn't renewed the full $520 million policy yet, but they'd agreed to a 6-month probationary coverage, contingent on verified progress. Perhaps the most telling sign was this. The doctor was invited to sit on the airline's new Passenger Experience Council, a group with actual voting power on service policies. He almost declined. But then he remembered the woman on the plane who couldn't breathe, the flight attendant who'd recorded the video, the crew members who'd finally found their voices. He said yes, not for himself, but for everyone who'd been made to prove their worth just to be treated like a human being. One evening after a long shift, he drove past the airport. Planes taxied under the golden hour light, engines humming like a lullaby. He thought about all the lives moving through that space, some heading home, some starting new chapters, some just trying to get through the day. And he hoped that now, more than before, they'd be met not with suspicion, but with simple, unremarkable respect. Because dignity shouldn't be extraordinary. It should be standard, like seatbelts, oxygen masks, and the quiet assumption that the person offering help is exactly who they say they are. A few weeks later, he boarded another flight. Same airline. Different crew. As he walked down the aisle with his medical bag, the lead attendant, a woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read "New Hire," smiled. "Doctor?" She asked gently. "Yes," he said. "Thank you for traveling with us," she said. "If you're comfortable, we'd be grateful to know you're on board just in case." "No problem," he replied. She didn't ask for his license, didn't demand he stow his bag. She simply nodded, made a note on her tablet, and moved on. He settled into his seat, buckled his belt, and looked out the window. The ground fell away. The sky opened up. And for the first time in a long time, flying felt like what it was always meant to be. Not a test of who you are, but a shared journey, trusting that when help is needed, it will be given and received without question. He closed his eyes not to sleep but to breathe. The hum of the engines, the gentle sway of the cabin, the unspoken understanding that everyone on board belonged there, exactly as they were. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.